Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Introduce ourselves before we get started with the webinar. Oh, hi, I'm Marie Fraticelli. I am the Region 1 specialist, Region 1 being from the West Virginia border over to Charlottesville and from Harrisonburg down to Lynchburg.
And I'm Jeannie Cummins. I'm the Region 2 housing specialist that covers sort of the greater Northern Virginia area.
I'm Cherie Hilliard, and I'm the Region 4 housing specialist, which covers the Central Virginia area.
Eric Lebo here, Housing Services Manager, and I cover the entire state. Our housing specialists keep me straight in that area. So.
And Anna Bowman is our Housing 3 specialist. I don't know if she's on the phone, but she is for Southwest Virginia.
Webinar guidelines. We ask that you use the chat box to ask questions. The moderator will forward your question to the presenter to be answered as soon as possible. We can go back and address any questions you may have from previous slides, but we do ask that you keep your questions generalized. For specific questions about specific individuals, we ask that you address those questions with your housing specialist. This webinar is the first of a two-part series created by DVHGS for support coordinators. Part 1, which you will cover today, is about conducting housing assessments and developing housing action plans. Part 2 focuses on making housing referrals, requesting reasonable accommodations, and utilizing flexible funds. If you have recently completed a referral form for an individual in the settlement agreement population who is planning to move into independent housing, the housing assessment has likely been emailed to you for completion. Ideally, it should be done prior to the referral. However, we do understand that sometimes time is of the essence and getting an available resource is a priority. Keep in mind that it is equally important to plan to reduce barriers to obtaining and maintaining housing, so whatever work can be done up front to ensure a smooth transition is well worth the time. The agenda. Today, we will cover the purpose of the Housing Readiness Assessment, how to complete the Housing Readiness Assessment, and how to use the Housing Readiness Assessment to complete a housing action plan. The Housing Readiness Assessment serves multiple purposes. It helps to assess an individual's readiness for integrated independent housing. Independent housing doesn't mean necessarily that the individual will live alone. It can mean living alone, but it can also mean living with friends or family, as long as the family is not a parent, grandparent, or guardian, or it could be living with a live-in aide. Readiness is not about having the skills to live independently, but more so about having the supports an individual will need to live independently. The individual's ability to afford to live in his or her own home, and having the documents that are necessary to access housing. The Housing Readiness Assessment helps to reveal barriers to housing the person may face, such as poor or no credit, criminal history, eviction history, and things of that nature. It also helps to identify the individual's unique housing needs, such as where in the community the individual needs to live. Do they need to live near school or work or natural support? Will he or she require an accessible unit? Or does the individual need a live-in aid? The Housing Readiness Assessment helps to ascertain the housing strengths the person brings to the table that can help minimize barriers or make the individual's rental application stand out in the crowd. Some examples include rent references or good credit. Lastly, the Housing Readiness Assessment helps to gauge the individual's potential eligibility for different housing options and resources in the community, especially if there are no resources for the settlement agreement population currently in that area. Please note, the Housing Readiness Assessment is recommended for all referrals. It is, however, mandatory for certain referrals. So it's mandatory for those referrals that reveal evidence of housing barriers, or where the information about services and support is unclear or contradicts FIDE's information. During this webinar, we will show you how to complete a housing readiness assessment. If you have your laptop, tablet, or a hard copy, please follow along and make notes as we go through the assessment step by step. The housing readiness assessment consists of 5 criteria. The first criteria is documentation. Having the necessary documentation for rental assistance and/or the landlord approval process is extremely important. We will cover the types of documentation needed in Section B of the Housing Readiness Assessment. The second criteria is planning. Planning is also important when assisting a person to move into independent housing. Planning should address barriers to housing and include how to cover upfront costs associated with moving. The third criteria is household composition. Knowing what the household composition is going to be should be determined early during the planning stages. If the household will include roommates and/or live-in aid, it's important to identify who those individuals will be and ensure that they have the necessary documentation for the rental assistance and landlord approval process, and that they are aware that they will also have to complete a background check. The fourth criteria is budgeting. Budgeting is key in planning for a move into independent housing. Budgeting allows you to assist a person with determining their monthly income and expenses in order to determine the affordability of moving into independent housing, as well as to identify ways of increasing income or decreasing expenses. Many individuals might believe cable TV is a priority and might not fully understand that if the electric bill isn't paid, there is no TV, let alone cable TV. Things like this can be used as learning opportunities. The fifth criteria is person-centered planning. The person-centered individual support plan should, at minimum, identify access to resources, whether they are paid or unpaid, and address functional limitations and/or needs for assistance in independent housing. We did introductions earlier for our housing team. This slide represents the BBHCS regional map. The housing team has specialists in each of the 5 regions across the state. In case you aren't sure which region you are in, this color-coded map should be of assistance to you. So for Region 1, which is Western Virginia, we have Marie Fraticelli. Region 2, Northern Virginia, Jeannie Cummins Eisenhower. Region 3, Southwestern Virginia, Anna Bowman. Region 4, Central Virginia, Cherie Hilliard. And Region 5, Eastern Virginia, Kim Rogers. The housing team is led by Eric Lebo, who works in our central office, with support from Ashley Cooper, who manages the referrals, and Melvin Ball, who manages the state rental assistance program. And now we will begin to create a housing readiness assessment. Meet Jeffrey Jones. Jeffrey is 30 years old. He lived with his mother until she lost custody, and he went into foster care. While in foster care, he started to display some behaviors that caused him to be placed in a residential facility. When Jeffrey turned 22, he was discharged to his grandmother, who brought him home to live with her, his uncle, and several cousins. Jeffrey's grandmother, with the help of the discharge coordinator at the residential facility, secured SSI and Medicaid for him. She also helped him get on the waiver wait list through the local CSB 8 years ago. Jeffrey doesn't know if he has a case manager. Jeffrey's grandmother is facing some medical needs of her own and isn't sure if she can still take care of Jeffrey. Jeffrey has great skills for self-care. He can make sandwiches and use the microwave to heat frozen meals. He can make his bed and tidy up his room. He cannot speak in a way that is easily understood by most. He has diabetes and requires assistance with his medical needs. Although he has a history of behaviors, since living with his grandmother, he has not had any behavior issues. He has difficulty counting and paying for things. So his grandmother informally manages his money for him. Jeffrey has a large extended family, and his brother James has come forward and agreed to be his live-in aid if he were to move out on his own. His essential information slide is pretty self-explanatory. Please list all of the individual's information as requested. It is important to notify the DBHCS housing team if the support coordinator should change during or after the referral process has been initiated. Housing specialists conduct follow-up with support coordinators to identify where individuals are in the process of obtaining rental assistance. The follow-up helps to identify if there are any housing barriers preventing individuals from moving into independent housing and/or to offer technical assistance when necessary. An individual may or may not have a substitute decision maker. However, they should have an emergency contact person in case of an apartment fire or other emergency. Once someone has a landlord, there should be release authorizations on file for the leasing company, landlord, and emergency contact. There are instances when the CSV is the first point of contact in an emergency situation. If the release authorizations aren't updated, should an incident occur in a housing situation, urgent communication can be delayed. Housing barriers are circumstances that reduce an individual's chances of qualifying for housing assistance or having an application for housing approved by a landlord. The documents needed on the first part of this section are good to have in general. However, they are critical when applying for housing using rental assistance or when completing an application with the landlord. The documents needed for housing include Social Security card, government-issued ID, birth certificate or proof of citizenship, proof of income, and bank statement. Social Security cards and award letters can take time to obtain, as can birth certificates and government-issued IDs, particularly if the individual was born in another state. These documents can also be costly to get. Keep in mind that transition funding or flexible funding can help with the cost of getting these documents. Depending on the individual circumstances, there might be trust fund documents or bank statements or other asset documentation that can take time to accumulate. Please note, Virginia just began participating in a new SSA pilot to get replacement Social Security cards online. For more information about the new online services, you can visit the website that's located on this slide, www.socialsecurity.gov/SS-number. Housing barriers can include whether or not the individual you are assessing has ever had trouble with paying bills, has a history of unruly guests or visitors that do not leave, or difficulty managing clutter or repairs in their home. These are just a few things that should be addressed prior to a referral. However, if a referral has been made and processed, you still need to have a plan for these barriers. Pay the bills, address rules on guests, or have a plan to manage clutter and needed repairs. This document can be passed along to future case managers so they have a historical record and are able to see a problem resurfacing prior to getting out of control. Every X that is put in a box on the housing barrier summary should become an action item to address on the housing action plan. Unpaid bills related to housing and utilities must be addressed, or they will prevent the individual's rental applications from being approved. Okay. Additional housing barriers include manufacturing or producing methamphetamine and lifetime sex offender registration generally are no-goes in rental assistance programs, even with a reasonable accommodation request. In addition, if individuals elect to live with others who have been convicted of either of these offenses, they will not be able to participate in the housing subsidy program. Likewise, violent criminal charges and convictions or violent drug-related charges and convictions can be serious stumbling blocks, so sometimes a reasonable accommodation can be requested if there is a direct relationship between the charge and the person's disability. The person has participated in treatment, services, support, education, or counseling has been established in order to address the behavior and minimize the likelihood of recurrence, and a significant amount of time has elapsed without any recurrence of similar behavior. These are housing strengths. A reasonable accommodation can be requested by the individual or a member of his or her support team and be presented to the landlord or housing agency to overlook past criminal issues. These past criminal issues, though, have to be directly related to the individual's disability. The same can be said for credit history that is poor or non-existent. Most landlords do credit checks. Some require a credit history showing no outstanding debt or evictions. Some require at least a positive credit history showing that there are no outstanding debts and that there's been a long period of time that the individual has made on-time payment of loans, credit cards, and other bills. A reasonable accommodation can be requested to overlook previous credit issues if the credit issues were directly related to the individual's disability. Those without a positive credit history may be permitted to rent only if they have a co-signer on the lease. It would be helpful to get a credit check prior to even beginning the process of independent housing if possible. This, too, can be an opportunity to learn and educate the person you're working with on the importance of paying bills and managing money. Free credit checks are available once a year from each of the 3 major credit bureaus at www.annualcreditreport.com. This website is also listed on the slide. This website is endorsed by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. As mentioned earlier, budgeting is key to planning a move into independent housing. There are 2 budgets individuals who move into independent housing must eventually develop. One is a budget for the cost to transition into housing. Another is for the cost to live in housing. This section on upfront financial assistance is meant to get individuals thinking about what financial assistance, if any, they may need to move into housing. Later on, we'll look at assets individuals have to help cover these upfront one-time expenses. However, if an individual does not have assets, it will be important to identify resources or in-kind assistance to cover these upfront transition costs in order to prevent it from becoming a housing barrier. If the individual is a year or more out from living independently, this is a good starting point to justify creating a budget that estimates the cost of each of these items and helping the individual find ways to save for these costs in the future. However, if the individual is ready to move in a more immediate future and they don't have the financial means to cover the upfront costs associated with moving, such as holding fees, security deposits, utility deposits, household goods, and furniture, flexible funding is available. Flexible funding is administered locally through area CSBs. Follow this link to identify the CSB administrator for your area. The Flexible Funding Administrator can guide you on the appropriate use of flexible funding. So far, we've covered the following sections of the Housing Readiness Assessment: essential information, housing barriers, and upfront financial assistance. Are there any questions that anyone has that we can review at this time? Should you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the chat box and we will address each question as they come in. So it looks like we don't have any questions yet. Thank you for your time. I'll be handing the presentation over to Jeannie Cummins Eisenhower, the Region 2 Housing Specialist.
All right, thanks, Kim. So the next section on our housing readiness assessment is about housing history. In this section, we're going to review the individual's housing history in different residential settings, such as state facilities, residential programs, the family's home, transitional programs, shelters, detention facilities, and even the street. So dates can be very useful for future information. When it's applicable, you want to note what was beneficial or undesirable in each setting that the individual lived in. Why? Because this information is really helpful. It can suggest what about a specific setting, such as the environment, like noise level or lack of privacy, inaccessibility, a shared bathroom or other type of room, different kinds of features like poor lighting or a gas stove, or amenities and supports, whether they're paid or natural supports, may be helpful or not so helpful to the individual in independent housing. You also want to look for potential renter strengths. For example, was the individual responsible for paying a residential fee in a residential program they lived in the community, like a group home or transitional housing or permanent supportive housing? If yes, did that individual consistently pay that fee on time or in full, and in full? And if that's the case, that might be a provider agency that you could go back to see if they would be willing to write a rent reference letter, that could be used in the future to share with potential landlords where that individual might apply to. So we've just covered some lengthy sections of this housing readiness assessment. We're going to go to now rental history. The rental history section is a little different from residential settings. This part is specifically for leased dwellings as opposed to residential or more programmatic kinds of settings. So if the individual has not lived independently in independent housing, you can skip this section. Just put not applicable. So for this section, you're going to need to know whether the individual has lived in subsidized housing. In subsidized housing, the amount that the tenant contributes toward rent is based on a percentage of household income. There are two kinds of subsidies, tenant-based and project-based. A renter can take a tenant-based subsidy to any landlord that will accept it. And a project-based subsidy is typically attached to a specific unit at a specific property. So this is what the rental history section looks like. You want to pay specific attention to the section that says the reason for leaving. Why? It's because this section can uncover issues to consider when you're applying for housing assistance or apartments. For example, did the individual have lease violations? For what? Was he or she evicted and did he or she skip out? Is rent still owed? It might also suggest supports that could help the person maintain housing. For example, could you set up automatic bill payment? Or does the person need something a little more substantial, like a representative payee or in-home supports to teach house cleaning or handling conflicts with neighbors? You also want to look at the dates of residence. Red flags should go up if you see individuals who move from place to place, only staying a few months at a time in each unit. Point out this pattern to the person and ask what seems to be happening after living in a place after a few months. Finally, if the housing was subsidized and the individual was evicted or skipped out without informing the subsidy program, be aware that this could negatively impact the individual's eligibility for future rent assistance. This section may also reveal certain housing strengths, such as a history of living in a place for a year or more, paying rent on time and in full, leaving on good terms, and again, having landlords that are willing to serve as references. Next, we move to the section on the person's current housing information. The current housing situation really looks very similar to the housing history. It's just simply for the unit where the person lives right now. So if you don't know the answer to these questions, find out and don't put a referral in until you have a complete understanding of the current situation. If the person is currently leasing, find out if the current landlord will accept rent assistance and when the lease term ends. If the landlord will not accept rent assistance, the person could suffer penalties for terminating their lease early if the referral is made and rent assistance is then approved. So a support coordinator should obtain a copy of the current lease to find out what the conditions of the lease are as they relate to early termination. If the landlord has given the person a date to leave housing, we need to carefully coordinate the timing of that rental assistance referral. Knowing why the individual must leave the housing will offer clues to what supports the person may need in the next rental housing arrangement to successfully maintain their housing. It'll also suggest what housing barriers must be addressed. So it sounds like we have a question here. Let's see if I can get it back to you. Do you complete this section even if they lived with the family but were not responsible for paying rent? So the example is, did they live with the mother in her Section 8 unit? So yes, if that's their current housing, yes. And the answers to some of the questions are going to be, a little bit different. So for example, who pays the rent is not going to be the individual, but it's going to be the mother. Let's see. And the monthly rent will be whatever mom is paying in the monthly as the tenant contribution towards the monthly rent. But it's not going to be the individual's monthly rent. It's going to be the mom's monthly rent. And are they on a lease? Yes, but again, and they're going to need to know the date the lease ends. But it's going to be less applicable because, again, this individual is going to be basically living with their family. So that's less of a problem because that individual can move out of their family's household without it being without being penalized. However, what you need to be aware of is when the individual moves out of their family's household, when the family is on a rent subsidy, that's going to change the family's eligibility for the rent subsidy that they're in, because they're no longer going. The family is no longer going to be. Let's just say it's a mom and her son. That mom and her son possibly were eligible for a subsidy for a 2-bedroom apartment. That mom now is only going to be eligible for a subsidy for a 1-bedroom unit. So it's going to change the equation for that family's housing and what they are eligible for. So that family needs to understand the impact to their housing because they were on a subsidy. So there are going to be impacts to the family that may affect the decision making around the choices for what happens with the individual's housing. So that's actually a really good question because it makes a difference for that family. I see you typing, Kim. Did we say that the individual cannot live with the parent and receive rental assistance? So yes, well, in our rental assistance programs, that is the case. So for example, when we're talking about referrals for state rental assistance, the DBHDS state rental assistance program, or one of the housing choice vouchers that is specifically designated for a preference for the settlement agreement population, individuals who are referred, who cannot be referred with a household member that would be a parent, grandparent, or guardian. If they're referred with that kind of household composition, they'll be deemed ineligible. Any other questions? Looks like we're good there for the moment. Good questions, though. Keep them coming. Okay. So actually, your question leads right into the next section, which is about household composition. So this section on household composition identifies other people who will be a part of the individual's household when he or she applies for rental housing. In this section, you're always going to list the individual first because for our programs, this person's always going to be deemed the head of household. Why do we ask for date of birth? So the individual must be the age of majority to be able to sign a lease. That's sort of the bar none biggest reason. However, we also look at other kinds of factors. For example, if there's a household member that's age 62 or older, that household member may qualify for certain senior housing options. So we look for age for a couple of different reasons. Now, why would we ask about relationship status? Well, depending on the type of relationship, other people in the household may have their income included in the calculation of household income for purpose of determining eligibility for a rent assistance program and for determining the percentage of household income the household contributes toward rent. For example, roommates may have their income included. However, if an individual requests a live-in aid as a reasonable accommodation, which is an exception to the housing program's rules, and this request is approved, the aid's income is excluded from consideration. Live-in aids typically don't have tenancy rights, but they are allowed to live in the unit as long as they provide essential care and supports for the well-being of a person with a disability in the household. When a live-in aid resides in a unit with an individual with a disability and provides this assistance in lieu of paying rent, there may still be an employment relationship with minimum wage and/or overtime obligations. So we strongly suggest that you review the U.S. Department of Labor's Guide for Individuals and Families to Home Care. Why do we ask about full-time student status? You'll see that blue arrow pointing there. Well, that's because a unit cannot be occupied solely by full-time students in the low-income housing tax credit program. In addition, the Housing Choice Voucher Program also does not provide rent assistance to households composed solely of students. So students are kind of a special category in a lot of housing programs, and there are a lot of restrictions for students, households that are solely students. So we need to be very careful and make sure that we look at those particular households and manage them properly, or else we could potentially shut them out of housing. Why do we ask about gross monthly income? Well, we need to confirm that the gross monthly income of the household won't exceed the maximum for certain programs, such as state rental assistance or housing choice vouchers, but will also meet the minimum income for other programs. For example, the tax credit housing program, especially if there's no rent subsidy being provided. Next, why do we ask if each person has agreed to be a household member? Well, this is a really critical one, because if the person who's been listed as a part of the household, either as a roommate or a live-in aid, bails on that household, it could completely change that household's eligibility for the resource that they've been referred for. So when we receive referrals that say roommate TBD or live-in aid TBD, you can bet your bottom dollar that that referral will be pended or returned to you, because we cannot predict we cannot make a decision or make any kind of referral with that, because we don't know anything about that person, and we just cannot determine what resource that household could potentially be eligible for. We covered a lot of information on this one slide. Are there any questions specifically about household composition?
Two people are present. There's a question.
Okay.
Two questions.
Let me see if I can back up and see those. So Kim says, I just want to make sure I understand. An individual being discharged from a facility at age 20 cannot receive a housing voucher if they continue attending high school full-time. So an individual who is still in high school under IDEA and is the sole member of the household is not likely to be able to get a voucher because they are still considered a full-time student. So, however, if they were to live with somebody as a roommate that was not a full-time student, they would qualify. So that's one of the issues. However, yes, Eric just pointed out to me, if they live in a jurisdiction where we're currently operating state rental assistance, state rental assistance does not have that exclusion of high schools or of full-time students. We very purposefully set it up that way. So we would consider them for state rental assistance. It's really only the federal voucher program that has that exclusion for full-time students. So we will try to consider them, and that's why we have to look very carefully at these referrals. And there was another question right below that. David asks, if an individual is currently employed and has some form of compensation, but also has one eviction, would they still be eligible for housing? So that's an it depends question. If they have an eviction, they're going to likely be eligible for rental assistance. That's not going to impact their eligibility for rental assistance. Depending on what the eviction was for. If it was for example, one of those what we call barrier crimes, meaning a sex offense or distribution, production, manufacture of meth in federally assisted housing, then likely, yeah, they're probably not going to get considered. If it was for a violent crime, it may be very difficult to overcome that, just depending on whether you could push for the push for a request for a reasonable accommodation and make the justification. But if it's for an eviction because it was due to unpaid rent or something like that, there's still a possibility that they could qualify. It just depends on the circumstances. And it might be more difficult. Right. So, and Kim points out the bigger issue is not their eligibility for rental assistance, but whether they're going to have difficulty finding rental housing, finding a landlord that will accept them, accept their rental application based on their rental history that has basically a ding on it for an eviction. So that's the bigger issue. So they may be able to get through the rental assistance process. It's whether they're going to actually be able to find housing in the community because of that eviction on their record. That's the bigger issue.
And then there's another one. I think she's asking about the SRAP area.
Oh, and so Kim asks, what are those areas? And Kim, we're interpreting your question to mean, what are the areas where state rental assistance is available? And we can send out, perhaps after this phone call, what we will do is we'll send out a follow-up email to everybody that lists the areas where state rental assistance is currently available. In fact, let me write a note just to remind us. Email areas where SRAP is available. Thank you for that question. It's a good one. Okay. All right. So that's household composition. We'll keep chugging along here. Our next section is on income verification. And the first part addresses assets that are available up front for housing costs. So occasionally individuals have assets that can help cover one-time upfront housing expenses, such as security deposits, utility deposits, furniture, moving expenses, etc. These should be listed in this section E. Some of the resources individuals might have include individual development accounts, savings accounts, special needs trusts, or the new ABLE accounts that you may have heard of, which are basically like 529 college savings plans, but they're specifically for disability-related expenses. If you're more interested in learning about these resources, we've shared links in the presentation on the right-hand side. Just a quick note, for housing purposes, individual development accounts can only be used to help save for a down payment on a home. It can't be used for upfront expenses associated with renting. However, special needs trusts or ABLE accounts could help pay for upfront housing expenses like security deposits, application fees, utility deposits, furniture, household supplies, moving expenses, etc. So this section E ties directly back to the section that Kim was talking about in terms of some of those housing barriers that may be associated with not being able to afford some of those upfront expenses related to the transition to getting into housing. So you can see how these two sections sort of relate directly to each other. The next section, section F, under income verification, is about work and vocational training. So employers can provide verification of income for rent assistance programs and for rental applications that you submit or individuals submit to landlords. Employers can also serve as positive rental references, especially when somebody has a limited or non-existent rental history. Now, you want to be aware that participation in vocational training can have a variety of impacts on individuals' eligibility and the amount of rent or amount of assistance received in certain rent subsidy and affordable housing programs. So, for example, it can reduce countable income in the Housing Choice Voucher and State Rental Assistance programs, which basically lowers the percentage of income that people pay toward rent, at least in their first year of the program. So that's a good thing. In the Housing Tax Credit Program, households that consist solely of students, those folks who would otherwise be ineligible for occupancy, well, if the person participates in vocational training, that will make that household eligible if one of those students is participating in a federal, state, or local funded employment or vocational program. So Kim, back to your question. If you're a student that was 20 years old and in high school and was still participating in special education, but if part of their special education program was to be going to a DRS-funded vocational training program for the day, for part of the day during high school, then as part of their transition plan, then they would be eligible. So there you go. We figured out a way to be able to make them eligible. So that's why this section is really important, because under household composition, we might have thought, oh, darn, they're never going to be eligible for a voucher. But you fill out this section and you note that they are actually in a DRS-funded vocational training program, and boom, we found an exception to be able to make them eligible again. Oh, you're welcome. Happy to help. That's why, so folks, I hope right there this made this workshop very valuable, because these are the kinds of things that we have to look for to be able to find the exceptions to the rules to help make people eligible for housing assistance. All right, so now we come to the big kahuna of the Housing Readiness Assessment, the budgeting section. So this is sort of the make or break piece of the Housing Readiness Assessment, because you can have all of the documentation that you need to get into rental assistance programs, and you can have all the upfront funding you need to be able to get into housing, but if you can't make it even with rental assistance and the security deposit and the stuff that you need on a day-to-day basis because you can't afford your food and your clothing, then your transportation, then it isn't going to work. So this estimated budget helps project what the individual's income and expenses will be in rental housing. The budget has to be either neutral or in the black, preferably with a little cushion of $10 to $20 in savings each month for the individual to be able to maintain housing long term. If the person has housemates, you want to prorate shared expenses and only include the individual's share in this budget. And if an expense is going to be fully paid by another source, like parents, or in this example, SNAP or a food pantry, don't list that part or that whole cost. Just write in the name of the source that will pay the expense in the alternative source column. So here you see this individual, Jeffrey, is going to pay $100 out of pocket for his groceries, but he's getting the rest of his groceries for the month from SNAP or a food pantry. If the individual has applied for a rent subsidy, you want to estimate the subsidized amount he or she is going to pay toward the rent and utilities, which rule of thumb is usually about 30% of monthly income toward rent and utilities, not including phone, internet, and cable. So in this example, if Jeffrey's total income is $815, the estimated subsidy amount, or estimated subsidized amount, is about $245. Unfortunately, if the individual has not applied for a rent subsidy, you're going to want to estimate the full cost of the rent and the utilities for that unit size. To project grocery costs when a person lives in their own home, you can look at that USDA Food Plan's cost of food report for the current month. And we've given you the website address below. Just find the appropriate age or gender and pick a plan that's most likely to represent that person's eating habits. So if they use a lot of prepared food, we suggest you go with the moderate or liberal plan. The cost that's given is for an individual in a 4-person family. So if the individual is going to be in a single-person household, there are some adjustment factors that you can use to basically ramp it up for the cost for one person. To project laundry costs, if the person's going to likely live in an apartment property where they're going to have to do their own laundry in sort of like coin-operated machines, we generally estimate that $1.50 to $2 per load is a good rule of thumb, plus about $5 for detergent for the month. And then when you're looking at savings, you want to aim for at least $20 in savings. Individuals really need to have a cushion in case something unexpected occurs, so like an out-of-pocket dental expense, job loss, their SSI decreases in a coming month because of job adjustments, things like that. So a little bit more on budgeting. Creating a budget is a really good time to look at ways to increase your income, whether it's through employment or maximizing benefit payments. Some people don't get their full SSI until they move out, and then they can actually, because they're paying their own rent on a lease, they can bump up their SSI. And it's a good way to look at reducing or eliminating expenses. It's a great time to negotiate between needs and wants. It could lead to some difficult but really productive conversations. For example, can the person eliminate cable and use the internet to stream their favorite shows? Can they shop for clothing at the thrift store or ask for clothing for their birthday? Is now the time to cut down on trips to 7-Eleven or maybe get a haircut from a neighbor instead of the beautician? ways to improve the budget outlook is to apply for benefits and resources that help reduce expenses and improve the housing budget. Chart H here prompts you to review resources the individual is eligible for, that they've applied to, and that they're receiving. By completing the chart, you can identify those benefits and resources that are already helping reduce expenses versus those that could help. Requesting benefits and resources for which the individual is eligible but has not yet applied should become part of the Housing Action Plan. So under resources, you can look at food resources from food banks, especially food stamps. And some of these resources can provide dual benefits. For example, if an individual is eligible and utilizing Meals on Wheels, that's a daily set of eyes on that could alert the case manager to an issue that might be discovered during a visit. Lifeline is a federal program that lowers the monthly cost of either phone or internet. And eligible customers can get at least $9.25 per month toward one of those bills. PCs for People is another really good resource that offers unlimited mobile internet service on Sprint's 4G LTE network to low-income individuals who are at or below 200% of the federal poverty level. There's a link here for more information about those two resources. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is housing location. So if the person you're working with has no preference for where they live, you can just contact your local housing specialist to learn where the most resources are available. So contact us and we'll let you know where those SREP resources are. You can also consider where services and supports, whether they're paid or natural, the individual may need are most likely to be available, as well as transportation, medical care, employment, and shopping. So what's really critical is you have to remember if the individual is going to move to a completely new place, how are they going to make the connections they need to be successful, whether it's to services, supports, friends, healthcare, et cetera. And are they going to be able to access the same services that they currently receive in the jurisdiction they are now? Uprooting people is never an easy task, and they may lose critical supports that they already have and may not be able to get them where they go. So we've covered these sections of the Housing Readiness Assessment: essential information, housing barriers, upfront financial assistance, housing location, the budget, quite a few. So I'm going to hand this presentation over to Marie, and she's going to take it from here.
Hi, everybody. We're going to finish up the Housing Readiness Assessment and then move into the Housing Action Plan. So this section of the Housing Readiness Assessment, Section 3, is Support Needs in Housing. Support needs in housing should reflect what is in the VIDES and in the person-centered plan. Pay special attention to the health, personal care, and behavior. However, any of these needs in any of these categories can result in catastrophic issues if not addressed prior to transitioning into housing. Consider communication. If an individual that is difficult to understand might need assistive technology when dialing 911, or someone who meets the level of care in an area of motor skills might require some environmental modifications prior to moving into their unit. Support needs in housing. The goal of the assessment is to ensure that the individual has assistance needed to maintain health and safety in rental housing and to comply with a lease in rental housing. With supports, it is possible for a great number of people that have a variety of support needs to live independently. It is, however, important to know if the supports are available in the locality where the individual wants to live, just as Jeannie had just pointed out. For example, if someone needs assistance with filling a medication box weekly, if they need help getting to and participating in doctor's appointments, or if the individual needs to be monitored to be sure they are keeping their environment clean and safe, and what must be in place when an individual moves in. For example, if the individual has a gait issue and needs accessibility modifications, or if they have diabetes and need a live-in aid to be available to detect and administer assistance in a diabetic emergency. Again, these are examples of things that you would want to add to the Housing Action Plan. Special considerations in housing. Trauma, exploitation considerations in housing. Some things that should be discussed with the team and the individual include things that can cause someone to become a victim of their neighbors, family, or in some instances, the surrounding community. Additionally, be honest and mindful of what the individual is likely to try in their new environment that you have not seen in previous residents. These are opportunities to make plans that will keep this person safe. It is important to list any history of trauma or exploitation that has occurred, as well as the supports put in place to reduce the likeliness of this happening again. Special considerations in housing. There may be special population considerations in housing. Are there limited resources? If there are limited resources in the area for individuals in the largest target population, does the individual fall into other special populations that might make them eligible for other resources? Housing specialists will review these responses and let the support coordinator know of potential housing options and what eligibility documentation may be needed. Building styles. Take note on the special building considerations. Does a person need accessibility due to a wheelchair, walker, or gait issue? Is the individual allergic to cigarette smoke? Do they have a sensory issue that might be exacerbated by a nearby pool or playground? Housing features you're familiar with and that are familiar and important to or important for. So I won't belabor the point because you all are very familiar with important to and important for. However, we need to consider deal breakers. Smoking, pets, showers versus bathtubs. It's unlikely you'll know what someone is willing to compromise on unless you ask them. Through the course of conversation, you might discover that there might be some things a person is willing to negotiate and others they are not. Just remember, the more important twos and important fours there are, the smaller the pool of potential housing opportunities there will be. The release authorization is important to be completed to submit to DVHCS for our records and yours. Please review and have the person you are working with sign the release. Think about other approved agencies the individual may want to add and what other agencies are assisting with the transition to be independent. Once the housing assessment has been completed and faxed to DVHCS housing team, a housing specialist will review it and identify which housing resources may be options for the individual. The housing specialist will send this package back to you for your review. It will include recommended housing resources and whether or not they are currently available. This is the last page of the Housing Readiness Assessment and concludes this part of our webinar. Are there any questions? Okay, if not, we'll move on to the Housing Action Plan. The Housing Action Plan is a way to work out and coordinate the details, barriers, and needed supports identified in the Housing Readiness Assessment. It also sets goals and divides chores among team members that are assisting an adult with independent housing. Completing the Housing Action Plan includes keep Housing Readiness Assessment in the person's chart so future service providers and or case managers have a complete picture of the person's housing history. Use findings from the assessment to develop the Housing Action Plan. Integrate the Housing Action Plan milestones into the person-centered plan. And if independent housing is the overarching goal for a number of outcomes, and update the goals on the Housing Action Plan as they are completed. So we're going to continue with Jeffrey as our person that we're supporting. Jeffrey's case manager, Helen Helpful, has completed the Housing Readiness Assessment. Jeffrey's brother, James, is willing to help with some of the action plan. James works full-time, so he's not able to do much of what needs to be done in preparation of the move. Jeffrey is not receiving active case management, and Helen has an active caseload, so there isn't additional time available to help with the tasks involved in transitioning someone to independent housing. Helen contacted the local flexible funding administrator and completed a flexible funding request which was approved for a housing transition support person. Helen reached out to the local Center for Independent Living to see if they had an experienced, qualified individual to assist Jeffrey with some of the housing transition service supports. Jeffrey and Helen decided to work with Hank Hauser for a fee of $25 an hour. He has a maximum of $652 for this service. Hank will bill for assisting with apartment hunting, furniture shopping, and possibly moving, as well as mileage associated with each task. As in the case with the Housing Readiness Assessment, compiling the individual's contact information should be the first step of the Housing Action Plan. Milestone 1, reducing housing barriers. These barriers were taken from the assessment. There is a section for describing the barrier, and then the plan to minimize or remove the barrier, and finally, when was the task completed? As you can see in one of the examples, Jeffrey's brother and case manager have divided the responsibility of helping Jeffrey get his birth certificate, Virginia State ID, and his Social Security card. Housing barrier number 4 is based on Jeffrey's financial resources. Although Jeffrey has a balanced budget, he doesn't have any additional resources that he'll need to move out into his own apartment. He doesn't have the first month's rent, security deposit, or money to put deposits on utilities, not to mention buying furniture and household supplies. In Jeffrey's neighborhood, there may be some resources that might be able to help with some of these needs. Catholic Charities or Monticello Action Community Action Agency could possibly help with some deposits and move-in expenses. In your area, there may be other resources that are specific to your area that you should access first. There may be some other agencies that are approached, but after the local resources have been exhausted, it would be appropriate for the case manager to put in a flexible funding request through the local flex funding administrator. We can give you the information. Each housing specialist knows the contact information for each flexible funding administrator. So feel free to call us and ask for that information if needed. Milestone 2, putting together a household. This section of the Housing Action Plan lays out the responsibilities of each member of the household. During the Household Readiness Assessment, we discussed at length that Jeffrey's brother is going to be his live-in aide. Whether he is an aide or a roommate, it is advisable that the chores and responsibilities be outlined prior to the pair moving into the apartment. Discussing chores and responsibilities and expectations can mitigate any disagreements down the road. Additionally, as a live-in aide, in lieu of rent, James has some responsibilities that one would not require of a roommate. Let me bring to your attention this bit of information on Section A1. It explains that James has a juvenile record for shoplifting. It is important to note that you are under no obligation to interrogate a potential roommate or live-in aide about their background. However, it would be advisable that you make it very clear that roommates and live-in aides may be subject to some background checks as the tenant during the leasing process. The hope is that if there is any concern, it can be addressed well before the lease-up process. You'd hate to get that far down the road and then find out that this individual is not going to be eligible to live in that apartment. Milestone 3, creating a living budget. This is a section of the Housing Action Plan that can be a deal maker or breaker, as Jeannie had pointed out in the Housing Readiness Assessment section. It might be the part of the plan that creates the person-centered plan outcomes for the long term. In the case of Jeffrey and his brother, James is his payee, and there are not a lot of issues with his budget and how he spends his money. We know, however, with a number of people, ourselves included, sometimes budgets are hard to live by, and making ends meet can change daily. It is important to note that a third party at times can be helpful with the process. Some communities have services to teach people how to live within a budget and to look at expenses and help individuals live within means. Going this route can prevent power struggles between individuals and support people, and can also connect the adults we support with various community helpers. Milestone 4, applying for housing options. This section of the Housing Action Plan is basically the apartment hunt. It is important to use this part of the Housing Action Plan to document your search efforts. All resources have an expiration date for finding an apartment. This information can be helpful in case you need to ask for an extension in the search process. It is important during your eligibility meeting and subsequent leasing process that reasonable accommodations be determined and discussed. In this example, there will be a need for a 2-bedroom apartment due to a live-in aid. Milestone 5, obtaining housing supports. Describe the plan to secure any supports that must be in place to ensure the individual can move into and maintain rental housing. In Jeffrey's case, he doesn't have waiver. However, his brother is providing needed supports by being the live-in aid and his payee. Flex Funding is paying for Hank Hauser to help with the moving process. His case manager is helping link him to community services. And finally, his extended family and friends are able to step in with any additional needs. If the individual has waiver supports, it is important to know if the services needed are available in your area. Milestone 5, obtaining housing tasks. Not unlike the Part 3 agreement page, this section of the Housing Action Plan discusses who will do what in the short term to help with the process of searching and applying for housing, moving, reviewing the lease, setting up utilities, and address change. Look at it as a check-off list for things that need to be done so that nothing gets overlooked based on the assumption that someone else is taking care of it. So everybody has a chore to do, and you make sure that you assign each chore and that everybody is on board with what they're going to be helping with. And hopefully then nothing will get overlooked. Milestone 5, obtaining housing accommodations and modifications. There are some reasonable accommodations and modifications you might be fully aware of at the outset of the apartment search, such as having a live-in aid. However, you might learn of others you need that you weren't previously aware of, or as time goes on, it might be clear that the individual might need an accommodation that they didn't previously need. We met someone recently who was living independently for a few years, hurt their foot, and then was not still able to get up and down the stairs, but due to their injury and their age, it was likely that this would be another mobility issue, and a reasonable accommodation was requested so that she could be put on the list for the next available first-level apartment. So these are things that long-term you need to be considerate of, and the Housing Action Plan can be utilized for those things. Milestone 5, obtaining housing and maintaining housing. Obtaining housing, specifically maintaining housing. In the case of Jeffrey, much of the work will be on he and his brother, the live-in aid James. The assumption is that James has already sat down with Jeffrey's team and has a clear understanding as to what his responsibilities as a live-in aid are, So this section would be redundant in this case. However, if Jeffrey did not have James or had waiver supports or a mixture of natural supports and waiver supports, it would make sense to complete this section so that everyone knows what their responsibilities are. Does anybody have any questions up to this point? I'm going to stop for a minute. Okay. I don't see any typing. Okay, I'll go on. Milestone 6, handling housing emergencies. This essentially is a crisis plan. In real life, things come up and emergency management is required. Having a plan is always a good idea for all of us. How would you handle the loss of a live-in aide or an impending natural disaster? Talk through these things, write them down, and review regularly, particularly for those individuals that don't have a waiver person-centered plan. And that was actually our last slide for the Housing Action Plan. And I see that somebody's getting ready to ask a question, so we'll wait. And if anybody else has any questions, please let us know. Our next webinar, while Jesse is writing, I'll let you know, our next webinar is going to be on the housing referral process, requesting a reasonable accommodation, and more on utilizing flexible funding. We're going to just do a deeper dive into those for the next webinar. Can I have a copy of both webinars? We will send out the copy of this webinar after today's presentation so that you can have a copy. And we're going to also put it on our DBHDS website as soon as we get a clean copy of it. We'll put it up there for everybody to be able to access when you want. And somebody else is writing.
I think you already have a question there.
Yeah, that's why we're going to send a copy of the PowerPoint so that you guys can have the links, the live link. What did it say now? I'm sorry.
So the question is, what are some of the barrier charges and conditions that tend to prevent people from obtaining rental housing?
So if you're on the sex offender list, that could be an issue. And as Jeannie mentioned, the methamphetamine, production of methamphetamines, and using the distribution on federal housing. So there's not that many.
Well, that's for rental assistance.
For rental assistance, right. So then each landlord then is going to do their own background check and make their own decisions based on their, policies as to who they let in.
And landlords can be much stricter.
Mm-hmm.
So they can impose whatever criteria they want related to criminal history. There's not really any holds barred in terms of what criteria they use, as long as it doesn't systematically discriminate against a particular population that would be protected by fair housing. So landlords often tend to have much more restrictive criminal background requirements, and they will look at charges and convictions of all kinds. So we have had individuals who have been excluded for property damage, property destruction, for things as simple as having what you would call simple assault on a police officer, meaning that they pushed them. I mean,
don't be discouraged
like
because
that.
there might be somebody else that would be willing to overlook that. And as the case manager, if it's something that you can advocate that an individual, it was because of their disability, you might be able to advocate a reasonable accommodation.
Right. Mm-hmm. And that's the key. So that means having an honest conversation with the individual up front and in advance about what the charge and conviction was and trying to discern whether it was related to, whether there's a direct relationship to their disability.
Right.
The next one was, will second webinar go through, I guess, the actual submitting and completing of the application?
Yes, we'll definitely. The next webinar, which is November 16th, we'll go through the actual referral. We're going to do it. We're going to meet Jeffrey Jones again. We're going to do a referral for him and explain to you how the process of the referral works so that you understand the hands that it goes through, what we all see, and then why you might get it back for a PEND or any of those, and then where it goes after that.
Then the next one.
Hold on, I think you missed one. So the one before that was, do you have a transcript of this session?
It's going to be uploaded onto, so we'll send you a copy, a PDF copy of the PowerPoint. However, we are going to have a webinar copy of it uploaded onto DBHDS's website.
Yeah, the intent there is so that, case managers change from time to time, so that if there's a new case manager that you want to share this training with, that they could go to a link on our website or on some hosted site where they can view this webinar themselves, so we're not constantly, deploying this webinar every 6 months or every 3 months or what have you. So it's recorded, so your questions are being captured, and will probably help others that may have similar questions in the community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and another question from Linnell Jarvis, is it extremely difficult for individuals with no credit history to find community housing?
It can be hard. That's why we recommend you do the housing readiness assessment and the housing action plan from the moment you discover that a person is interested in independent housing, because you can build their credit prior to them actually transitioning, and that's really the best way to move forward. However, again, if you have somebody at the last minute who really needs a resource and doesn't have a credit history, that could again be an opportunity to advocate on their behalf, find resources like employers or previous landlords. There are things you can do, and your housing specialist can help you work through that. But the sooner you start the process, the better, because it's something you could work towards building.
Yes, there are also multiple strategies for dealing with people who have poor credit, depending on what the issue with their credit is. So we would strongly suggest that you talk to us so that we can find out what exactly the issue with the credit is. And sometimes it often has to do with whether the issue is related to their disability, number one, and whether it's related to issues around payment of medical bills and things like that versus payment of housing-related expenses. So, so we encourage you to do that annualcreditreport.com review. If you're having difficulty figuring out how to read it, contact us and we will walk you through how to read it, and then we can sort of together discover exactly what we're looking at and problem solve strategies to being able to address it.
And you may not know if a person's identity had been stolen, as in the case with Jeffrey. He had a $5,000 Visa debt that he was not aware of. So that's something that you're going to want to check. Even if you think somebody has no credit, they may actually have bad credit. So you want to get that cleared up.
And then I think the last question, I don't know if we addressed it, but Lisa asked, would an assault charge against a family member be worth it?
So, yeah, it depends. In terms of a charge is not a conviction. So we're talking about convictions here. Now, if it's a pending arrest, so it's a recent arrest, that could impact their ability to move forward with the program. But again, if it's a current charge, they're going to look at that. But again, they're looking at convictions also. So they may not move forward with a housing decision at that time because of a pending charge. But again, if a person was accused of something but never convicted of a crime, then that may not impact their ability to move forward with either the rental assistance process or the housing process. Again, it has to be a conviction. Just because the mere fact that they were arrested, if charges weren't brought against that individual and it was dispensed as though no charges filed, then that will not prevent someone from moving forward because, again, it's not a conviction. But each individual situation is different. You got to understand the circumstances around that assault charge. Did they push a family member, or did they pull out a knife on the family member or something like that and hold them at knife point? That's a different charge. So you probably want to look at the seriousness of the offense. So each situation is different. It's kind of hard to give a blanket statement.
And did the family member call the police just because they were at their wits' end and charges were filed, even though the family member,
We had someone that was charged with theft, and they could have stole like a ballpoint pen, or did they steal the person's vehicle, piece of jewelry, something minor, but the family member could have called just to kind of teach the person a lesson. But then that came back to bite the individual in the rear end later in the process. So again, each situation is unique. It depends on the seriousness of the offense. But the key is to make sure that if that is a behavior, that you have a plan to address it, and you can speak to that when the housing person asks a question about it. I thought that juvenile records are still after the individual turns 18. Do housing programs have access to those records? I do not believe so. So any juvenile records should not impact their ability to move forward with their housing process. Cherie, is that all the questions that you showing there?
Can we just go back to, Kim brought up a good point, the question about credit history. There is a distinction between poor credit history and no credit history.
Yeah.
It can be a little easier if you have no credit history. It's still, if it's a competitive market, a landlord is going to choose, and when faced with two applicants, if a landlord is going to choose an applicant with a good credit history over an applicant with no credit history. But if the market is squishy and the landlord has an applicant with no credit history but no other issues, they might consider that applicant. And there are certainly strategies that you can do to get them to feel more comfortable with that applicant, such as offering them a higher security deposit, or potentially presenting them with the opportunity to have a guarantor or co-signer on the lease for a period of time. So there are different ways to approach the no credit issue, at least if you haven't had time to build credit.
Oh, somebody else is typing. Oh, they stopped.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
So the best, strategy would be to contact your housing specialist in your region, or contact any one of the housing specialists across the state. But we prefer that you contact your housing specialist in your region first. If you have any questions, each situation is unique and individualized. It's kind of hard to give you a blanket response for every individual situation. So call us. We'll do whatever we can do to help as a team.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Okay, so that concludes our webinar, and we hope that you'll come back on November 16th, excuse me, for the next one. Thank you.